All right, class. Let's start with the fundamental question that has intrigued philosophers for centuries. How do we know what we know? This might seem simple at first, but when you think about it deeply, it opens up all sorts of questions about reality, knowledge, and the self. Today, we'll be exploring how the two of the most influential philosophers, Plato and Rene Descartes, approached this question in their own distinct ways. As we go through their ideas, think about whose approach seems more convincing to you as the individual. Let's begin with Plato. Now, who can tell me about Plato's theory of forms? What does he say about the physical world? Yes, Plato argues that the material world, the world we can see, touch, and interact with, is not the true reality. It's said it's just a shadow of a higher, unchanging reality called the forms or ideas. He illustrates this with his famous allegory of the cave, where prisoners trapped in a cave mistake shadows on the wall for real objects. Only when one prisoner escapes and sees the world outside does he realize that what he thought was real was just an illusion. Now, if the physical world isn't true reality, how do we gain knowledge, according to Plato? How do we know what we know? Right. For Plato, true knowledge comes from understanding these forms, the perfect, eternal, and unchanging entities that exist beyond the physical world. He believes that learning is a process of recollection. The soul remembers the forms, which it is familiar with before birth. So according to Plato, knowledge is not something we acquire through our senses. In fact, he's very skeptical of the senses. He thinks they're unreliable because the physical world is constantly changing. Therefore, it can't provide us with stable, absolute truths. Does this make sense? Plato is basically saying that true knowledge is innate. I'm sorry, I gotta stutter. Innate, and can only be accessed through reason and philosophical inquiry, not through what we see or hear in the material world. Now, let's take a look at the other perspective. Let's shift to Rene Descartes. How do you think Descartes would answer the question? How do you know? How do we know what we know? Great. Descartes has a very different approach. He begins by doubting everything. In his work, Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes introduces something called methodological skepticism, where he systematically questions all his beliefs. He even doubts his senses, thinking that they might deceive him. He asks himself, what if I'm dreaming right now? Or what if an evil demon is tricking me into believing these things that aren't real? But then he arrives at something that he can't doubt. Do you remember his famous conclusion? Exactly. Cogito ergo sum, or in other words, I think, therefore I am. Socrates realizes that no matter how much he doubts, the very act of doubting proves that he exists as a thinking being. This is the indubitable foundation of his philosophy. From this, Socrates builds his rationalist system, asserting that true knowledge comes from reason, just like Plato. However, Socrates doesn't really rely on abstract metaphysical entities like Plato's forms. Instead, he divides reality into two substances: the mind and the body. The mind is where the thinking and reasoning occur, while the body belongs to the physical, material world. For Socrates, the mind is the key to true knowledge, because the senses could always deceive us. So, how do Socrates and Plato differ in their answer to how we know what we know. Well, you'd be right. That's right. Plato believes that knowledge comes from recollecting the eternal forms that our souls encounter before birth. Socrates, on the other hand, believes that knowledge comes from clear and distinct ideas that we arrive through rational reflection. Socrates' method involves a process of radical doubt, whereas Plato doesn't engage in the same kind of skepticism. He's already confident that the forms exist, and it's through reasoning about them that we gain true knowledge. Now, as we compare these two, think about which approach seems more solid to you. Plato offers a vision of reality where the physical world is a lesser copy of a perfect realm, while Socrates starts from the certainty of the self's existence as a thinking being. Descartes' system, which is rigorous doubt, leads to what seems like an unshakable foundation in the cogito. So, class, based on what we've discussed so far, which philosopher's approach seems more persuasive to you? How do you think we come to know what we know? I'm Rex Lee. Thank you.